Need to order. Any substitutions? Seeing none, no substitutions. One on this side, government side.
Holder for Savoy.
Thank you, sir. It is the pleasure of the committee to take into consideration Bill number 11, an act respecting proof of immunization. All those in favor, say yay. Yay. All opposed, please say nay. Motion carried. Minister, any opening comments or?
For being involved in this conversation, and I apologize for the technical difficulties that caused the delay here. Again, my department just migrated from one software package to another, which causes the usual chaos, and not in a particularly ideal day for that. So I apologize if I have any technical issues beyond my personal technical issues, which I'll raise to your attention if I need to take a break or recharge my actual batteries for the device in my ear and my phone.
Thank you.
So, getting into the subject of the bill. This bill's been here in its second iteration and has obviously been the subject of a great deal of public discussion over the last number of months. And it's become part of a national and global conversation around vaccine safety and around the efficacy of vaccines. And also the intersection between the state and the rights of individuals. And I think all those are important conversations that I think should absolutely be encouraged. Depuis maintenant, c'est plus d'un an, depuis.
For more than 1 year now, we have started this debate on this bill. So there was Bill 39 at first, and now it's Bill 11, and it clearly targets one thing: the need to ensure that all of our children are fully vaccinated against preventable diseases. And the reason for this is because of an increasing anti-vaxxers movement worldwide. We have seen them outside of the legislature today. There's also an extremist movement in the United States. So they used real parents' concerns regarding children's diseases, and they reached conclusions that are not based on scientific facts.
We're confronting as a legislature a difficult decision around what I will absolutely and straightforwardly on the record acknowledge is a limitation of rights. Because today, we are already limiting the rights of a number of young people in this province. Many of you have heard from them. They've been featured in the media. They reach out to me. Young people who can't go to school because they don't have the ability to get vaccinated. They have diseases that cause either their vaccines to be wiped out, which is common in cancer treatments, or have other immunosuppressed conditions that mean that they're not able to get vaccinated. So those vulnerable children were the impetus behind this bill and making sure they have access to an education, because their rights are being restricted today. And we're going to be discussing issues relating to the Charter, issues relating to our Constitution. And the Charter lays out clear descriptions about reasonable limitations of rights. And in this case, it's not a question of should a right be limited, it's a question of which right should be limited. The rights, again, of sick children who are sick through no fault of their own, or the rights of those who, perhaps with all good intentions, but clearly in some cases driven by those who don't have good intentions, have been driven to believe in a range of conspiracies around vaccine science, the safety and efficacy of vaccines, that doesn't just put their children at risk, but those vulnerable children and our entire community. We've all learned a lot through the course of the last few months about the world of diseases, through the discussions of COVID-19, discussions around herd immunity, which many of us may not have been familiar with before, are now part of our everyday conversations. And we have seen, through our lived experience of going through massive, unprecedented restrictions on our civil liberties during the course of the COVID-19 pandemic, necessary steps to protect us from illness and death, to protect, again, the most vulnerable among us. We've seen what the world is like without one vaccine to prevent one disease. And on the other side, we have hundreds of years of success with vaccines, starting with smallpox, moving on to others, more recently measles and other diseases, which have progressively reduced and in some cases achieved something that would almost seem like a miracle of eliminating diseases from the face of this planet. Those are gifts brought to us by the vaccine system that our country's been proud to be a part of from the very beginning. And from the very beginning, there have been pushback and protests against bills like the one we're discussing today. Those bills have tended to come at the moments when anti-vaccine sentiment was rising and were again necessitated by them. The same misinformation that we hear being spread today and amplified by certain friends to the south of our border are the same messages in updated forms that we've heard anti-vaccination activists use for literally 200 years. Beliefs in big government conspiracies on the one hand, belief that new technology is somehow responsible for spreading the disease. The list goes on, and I won't dignify them with a long description. I'm happy to answer any questions on that subject. So the question in the face of a restriction on rights, which side do we fall on as legislators? We're not here as public health officials. We're not here as doctors. We are here as legislators with a decision to decide whether we are going to uphold different groups within our society. And those are struggles we embrace every day. Whether we're going to side with unions or employers in a contracting dispute. Whether or not we are going to agree with one group versus another when it comes to any piece of legislation. It's the definition of our democratic system, is that we are asked by the people of the province and put in a position to make choices and decisions. And the choice in this case, again, is about which restriction is acceptable. Because we already have mandated vaccines in New Brunswick. We've had them for a number of years, and we had them in a period of time when acceptance of vaccines and understanding of their safety was just about universal. So we saw, in the face of that, what often happens when you have too much of a good thing is people get complacent. In our school system, we stopped keeping track of records in the way we should, and the public stopped realizing that we needed to defend ourselves against the viruses of misinformation that are unfortunately influencing some of the folks we can hear in the background here today. So given that we have a mandate, this bill asks one very specific thing: to remove from the law the ability for folks to use two of the three exemptions that are currently specified: religious and philosophical. So the religious objections are easy to deal with. There are no religions that have a position against vaccines. None. There are some religions, obviously, where there are activists who themselves are personally anti-vaccination, and that's obviously fine in a free society. But barring some small offshoots of Christian Science, occasional congregations here and there of people who in many cases have been actively targeted by anti-vaccination campaigners, and with the exclusion of a small religion in the US using the American somewhat interesting laws where you're allowed to start your own religion based on just about anything. So the same sort of folks who started religions to allow them to legally use peyote, other folks have started a religion to justify their avoidance of vaccines. Tiny group. So on the religious side, there really isn't much of an issue there. Philosophically, there is. And so philosophically, it comes down to, again, a pretty clear choice. And I think I'm hoping that we're going to have a full discussion around this, because I think that this bill is our contribution, regardless of how this House decides to vote ultimately. It's our contribution to a global debate right now going on between the forces of populism, of extremism, of voices raised without the backing or support of science, voices that speak to prejudice and exclusion, voices that lead to people writing to me saying, I don't care about their kids. They probably got sick because they're vaccinated. The folks who tracked down my partner's address and dropped off a 15-page anti-vaxxer letter to her yesterday. The folks who've been sending enough hate mail to all of us in this legislature for many months that it's caused concerns with security. This is the choice that we have. You don't hear people advocating for vaccines sending the same sorts of emails in the same sorts of tone. You don't hear doctors and medical associations with any credibility speaking out against vaccines. What you do hear on that side is concern and fear, and an unsureness about how to act. And I understand that. People in this House have received many thousands of emails. I would guess that the folks who write to me have written to all of the honourable members, and that number of emails certainly totals many thousands have come into my box, and it looks like most of them go to all of us. And what we have to deal with when we get those emails, we know that's part of our job, and we get them on other subjects as well, and we know that many of you have just said, well, that's what the delete key's for, and sometimes your finger gets a bit tired using it, but that's what it's for. But for other people who want to get involved in this debate, the climate that is being created around this discussion of claiming that people who support vaccines that have saved lives, probably including the lives of some of us in this chamber, who just through random chance in decades past, if we'd succumbed to one of the many diseases that can be prevented by vaccines, we would have likely died or been seriously injured. I know many folks in this House have had personal experiences in their families of people who've been injured or died because of vaccine-preventable diseases. For most people, they don't want to have to endure that. They didn't sign up when they thought they were defending something as obvious as the forces of gravity to receiving hate mail and abuse. And so the volume of correspondence that we receive is one-sided. But the population has been extremely clear. Poll after poll after poll shows that around 90% of New Brunswickers support this bill, and they support protecting our children through removal of the religious and philosophical exemptions from our current law. The arguments around this are clear. The health data around this is clear around the world, and the consequences of not acting are clear. We've seen, to use an example of a middle-income country in Samoa, where a series of unfortunate accidents where a couple of nurses used the wrong material. They gave some injections that were supposed to be vaccines and they weren't, and a couple of children, I believe they actually died. Nothing to do with vaccines. It was a mistake. But that was weaponized by a global anti-vaccination movement that poured resources into that country and drove down measles vaccination rates. And the result was an outbreak that killed many, many people just last year, something we've forgotten in the face of COVID-19 for understandable reasons, as this pandemic's been of much greater scale. But at the same time, those same forces are here. They're helping organize the groups outside. They're putting huge amounts of money into anti-vaccination groups, not just New Brunswick, but in other Canadian provinces, American states, and countries around the world. And they're doing it in some cases because of, I'm assuming, a genuine belief that they have uncovered some hidden truth or conspiracy. And in some cases, they're doing it because they recognize that it creates dissent and division and undermines the unity of Western democratic countries. I found it difficult in some conversations with some members when I've talked about something that is not just documented, but established by our own intelligence services, the intelligence services of all of our allies, that efforts to try and drive down vaccination rates and bump up the anti-vaccination movement have been core to the efforts of the Russian and Chinese governments in efforts to destabilize Western liberal democracies. This is on the record. This is not me saying this. We've talked in great length about the efforts by foreign governments to undermine the American election in 2016. We know that anti-vaccination accounts and bots were the second most common form of social media activity pushed by the troll farms organized out of Beijing and Moscow, next to efforts to try and elect now President Donald Trump. So that's the context in which we are operating today and within which we are making this decision. If we don't choose to defend reason and science, it's not because our vaccination rates today are too low. They are. It is nothing to do with our history in this province of having vaccine records in schools, though of course those are worth discussing. This bill is designed to be a defense against a rising tide of populist ignorance that threatens all of our health and safety. Because if we thought that the consequences of COVID-19 were devastating, not just to the lives of people around the world, but to the economy of this province, and to the mental health and sense of security that all of us took for granted in many cases before this pandemic arrived. I'll close my opening statement by pointing out that measles, a vastly more common disease than COVID-19, a vastly more transmissible and deadly disease than COVID-19, is on the way back. We're seeing it around the world, and it's on the way back because it's being enabled by an organized, well-funded anti-vaccination movement. So that is what this bill is about, a decision of whether we stand on the side of science or whether we succumb either through apathy, because I sincerely believe that no member of this House would possibly believe the conspiracies that are peddled by those folks, but whether we stand for science or we don't. And if we don't, history will judge us for our decisions in the House over the next little while in this matter. I can't think of anything more important that we should be discussing as legislators, anything that speaks more centrally to our job to stand up for the things that have made our society and our civilization strong and the need to try and move it ahead. And I hope I can earn the support for this bill as we move it through this reading. And apologize for any errors I make. This is my first time going through this committee process, so I ask indulgence of all the members and the chair as well as we go ahead in this. Thank you.
I'll open the floor up to the official opposition first and work our way around. Let's recognize a member for Victoria, Vallalet.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, before I begin, I'd like to read a statement into the record. It was a statement released by our leader on May 26th. It states, Mr. Chair, on the topic of vaccines, I want to make it clear that the entire Liberal caucus is in favor of vaccines as a means to improve public health outcomes. On Bill 11, there may be various reasons MLAs vote for or against the bill, including the question of individual rights, the use of the notwithstanding clause, and access to education. That said, the caucus is unanimous in its support of vaccines in general to improve the health of the general population. So I guess, Mr. Chair, where we have a little divergence is, I guess, on how we achieve that end. With that, Mr. Chair, I'd like to thank the Minister and his staff for being here today and allowing us to ask them questions on the bill. So I guess my first question would be, could the Minister explain what necessitated this bill? What event was a catalyst that brought this bill to light?
Was I supposed to have stood for my first remark? I apologize to the House and anyone else. Again, newbie. The motivation behind this bill was something that I've thought about this issue for a long, long time. This isn't something that I just happened to wander across after my election. That there was some coverage of my part in the participation in the province's response to COVID-19 recently, and it talked about how, I apologize, I will try and speak a bit louder. Please let me know if I need to bump up my volume, because the volume behind is...
I'm trying to hear over the...
Yeah. Just a bit louder? How's that? I also don't want to feel like I'm yelling, but anyway, just tell me either, just go up like that or down depending on the volume outside. So my interest in the role of how infectious diseases have influenced societies, this goes back a long, long time, back decades. And because it's something I think we don't pay a lot of attention to. It's something we've just learned in the last few months, that we just saw the consequences of a whole series of advanced societies around the world running headlong into COVID-19, in many cases with little or no preparations, falling into the same trap that World War I generals were said to have done when they were fighting the last war. That the first few weeks of this pandemic, we're all talking about what happened during SARS, what happened during H1N1. So the way in which politics and public health intersects is something I've always felt was really important. I've been following the anti-vaccination movement for 25, 30 years, because I find groups of people who have divergent points of view interesting. I'm someone who's certainly got lots of odd opinions myself, perhaps, and I've always found other people who, the way they approach problems and how they analyze them, to be one of the things that makes humans fascinating. But when you start to see that you get whole groups of organized people who are willing to set aside what I had sort of thought was a basic fundamentals of our science-based, reason-based approach to looking at problems, and genuinely believe that, I think we often have a conceit in countries like Canada that we think that people who follow odd cults or ideas, or somehow that's for some people in other places somehow. But my experience working around the world are that people are all pretty much the same no matter where you are, and have the same strengths broadly and the same weaknesses. And one of our weaknesses is a search for narratives that give explanation to horrible things. And the anti-vaccination movement has always preyed on those who've experienced loss or injury. And so my concern with the way that anti-vaccination groups work, and my longstanding interest in them, is because there's nothing more difficult, and we saw this last summer with the hearings held here in this building. When you hear a mother talk about an injury her child suffered shortly after receiving a vaccine, and you can understand how, in her pain, she would be looking for any explanation that would make sense. And when the doctors who told her that everything was going to be just fine, suddenly she sees that things aren't just fine, she's looking for a reason. The same way that I think many people are questioning medical science as a result of this pandemic because of changes in medical advice caused by nothing more than all of us trying to figure our way through this, including the scientists, and acquire information and come up with the right answers. And part of the problem as well is that science itself is open-ended, that science doesn't give you this is 100% all the time, this is 100% right or wrong all the time. It says, look, this is a process. The scientific method includes in itself the ability for anyone to prove anything that was seen as being 100% factual to be wrong. And so real science, because it has that intentionally open-minded and open-ended approach to every single problem in the world, means that when you end up with... No worries. So the problem is that that we are now facing the rise of larger and larger movements asking bigger and bigger questions about vaccines, linking vaccines to government conspiracies. I'm sure all of you have had the same accusations. That's why he's the chair. Linking vaccinations to plots that apparently we are all responsible for. I know all of you here in this chamber have received your big pharma checks that we're all accused of taking and cashing multiple times a day. This movement has been something I've been interested in for a long time because I believe it poses a danger. And this bill is designed to build what I hope can be a firewall so that no matter what comes in the next months and years ahead, and I would guess that members on all sides of the House would agree that we are facing a difficult moment when faith in science and institutions is coming under more threat and pressure than it probably has at any point in any of our lifetimes. That this bill is a firewall to protect the safety of our school children, at least. Because this won't be the end of this discussion. Vote yes or no on this bill. If there's a vaccine for COVID-19, how will we have that conversation? These are the problems that we're all going to have to face as legislators. The question now is what we do about it. I hope I answered the member's question and apologize for the volume issues.
You more or less answered my question. Excuse me, Mr. Chair. The Minister more or less answered my question. I'd like to talk a little bit about specific incident in south of the region, in Anglophone South, that kind of got tangled up in the whole beginning of this bill, and I'd just like to maybe, if the Minister could tell me, basically I think it was a measles outbreak. Where do you feel, or how many people were involved in this measles outbreak? Can we get that number first?
Through the chair to the honourable member. This bill actually had nothing to do with that measles outbreak. It was an interesting example of timing that popped up and illustrated, I think, one of the arguments for having the need for a bill like this. But it actually has the two are unrelated. So I'm happy to get. I have a terrible memory for numbers, so I'm happy to get the numbers directly from my staff, but I do want to emphasize that this bill's origins came from when I first took over the department. Having had a long-standing interest in education, I knew that our vaccine monitoring systems weren't as strong as they should have been inside the school system, and so I moved on trying to improve those. I can go back and check it to get you the exact date, but it would have been still in 2018, to the best of my recollection, long before the measles outbreak took place down in the south of the province. But there was a reasonably small number of cases, well controlled, thanks to quick action by public health. But I'll get you those exact numbers, and if you'd like, given again, I know this process is a bit odd. I can include your answer specifically to that question once my staff feed it back into my ear and keep on going that way. Does that work?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you for the answer, through you, Mr. Chair, of course. So there were a number of cases, we're not sure how many, but my recollection tells me probably a dozen cases. And we know that in any batch of vaccines, there's probably a certain amount that are not going to be effective, be it the makeup of somebody's own genetics or whatever. Do we know if any of these people that were involved in that small outbreak in St. John were previously vaccinated? Do we know if any of that was happening?
Well, that gets into medical information that was not shared at the time by the Chief Medical Officer, and I'm not able to share that information. I'm sorry. I can speak more generally and say that nothing to do, make it clear, with the St. John outbreak, that folks who have been only partially vaccinated are just that, only partially vaccinated. And so people who have not had all their boosters, for example, sometimes the vaccine doesn't take, which is why you need to have the full course. And to your point, quite correctly, there are also people who can be fully vaccinated and the vaccine doesn't take for some reason. And it's that failure rate that means you have to have an even higher level of vaccination to make sure that people who either can't get vaccinated for medical reasons or the vaccine doesn't take for whatever reason, that you maintain the herd immunity that varies from vaccine to vaccine. So sorry, I can't give the specifics in that case. I do believe you're correct in the around 12 number. My staff are checking now, and they think it is 12 as well. So 12 for your previous question, and I'm afraid I can't give specifics on your most recent one.
Thank you, through the chair. Yeah, I'd just be kind of curious to know whether there was any of that involved in this outbreak, but that's fine. Let's move on to the protocols that were in place at the time, the system that was in place to protect pretty much everybody, I guess, those who were immunocompromised as well as those who were not vaccinated. Could you tell me a little bit how that worked? I mean, how were the records created? Where did these records go? Who had control of these records? And why it is that we don't really have an accurate picture of just how many people are vaccinated and how many are not?
Chair, through you to the honourable member, so I'm just going to ask my staff, as I'm standing here, if they can get me the details on the exact process side to make sure that I don't give you any inaccurate information and I'm as precise as possible. Again, to emphasize that that outbreak has nothing at all to do with this bill. The bill was conceived long before the outbreak happened, and so very happy to discuss it, but it was not the inspiration for this bill, it isn't the subject of this bill, and our process of fixing up the vaccine records is absolutely necessary, but unrelated to the subject of this bill, and except in as much as it's also about vaccines. So as they're getting me the exact process, to go through what's happened with that. So the reasons why we had to do a catch-up effort on vaccine records in New Brunswick, and a couple of other steps that we're moving ahead on. So the records are designed to be provided on entry into the public school system. And so you go into school, and when you sign up for school, you're supposed to give your vaccine records unless you give an exemption. So up to now, you can give a religious, philosophical, or medical exemption. Many people, even if they have medical exemptions, according to some who've talked to me about it, have used philosophical exemption just because it's easier to get. As we all know, and you've raised it, and your colleagues multiple times in the House, the difficulty of accessing family physicians in primary care. That applies in just about everything. If you have an option of going to see your doctor or not, maybe you won't. So you either provide an exemption or you provide proof that you've been vaccinated. So in recent years, because of, I think, the belief, and this is a subjective opinion, but because of the belief that everyone was getting vaccinated, attention to the vaccine regime in the school system really dropped off. And public health and education dropped the ball on this over many years. And accurate records were not kept up to date. And it was the process of finding that out, realizing that we were not taking this seriously, that led me to push our system to start to collect that information and data. So that was actually moving along quite nicely until, unfortunately, COVID-19 intervened, which is somewhat ironic. And we now have up-to-date information on all but 2 districts. And I believe, as long as I'm legally allowed to share that, I'll happily share all that data. And that's where we are in terms of that system now. So as soon as we're back to public health being able to put some resources back into verifying vaccine records, which is their job in that process, so it's a partnership between education and public health. As soon as they can get back to doing that work, which again, and this is no criticism of public health, they've got COVID-19 to deal with right now and schools are closed right now, so it's an appropriate allocation of their resources. When they get back and finish that work up, we'll be able to finish up the record keeping and make sure we, from now on, have an accurate tally, regardless what happens with this bill, of students who are vaccinated and those who aren't, and for whatever reasons as well. And in addition to that, the Chief Medical Officer and her team have been working for some time on a provincial vaccine registry, which we hope to be able to merge our system into, which will allow for a province-wide vaccine system, because I would guess any members who have traveled in those far away days when we were allowed to leave the borders of our province and go places, that if you went to a lot of places, you needed to have vaccine cards. And I often get a lot of anti-vaxxers saying, well, show us proof you've been vaccinated. And having spent years of my life working in places like South Sudan and other places with lots and lots of transmissible diseases, I had a little stack of blue cards and had, I don't know how many shots I've had over the years. But anyway, so that system is going to be up and running in the next year or so, hopefully, but you'd have to ask the Chief Medical Officer about the details of that, because her timing might, of course, also be thrown off by COVID-19, which has disrupted everyone's plans, but of course, especially hers. And I'm just getting some data back here. So it's the nurses who verify the data that's collected by the department, and we have 85% of the data complete now. Used to be 82% with all in, so now we're already at 85 and still have some work to do, which again we'll be able to finish off as soon as the pandemic allows us to do it. And we again have 2 districts, one Francophone, one Anglophone, that haven't submitted their data yet, so the gaps that we have are regionally based because of that. Hope that answers your question.
It kind of partly answers my question. I guess what I'm looking for clarification on is the system that was in place to collect the records. And my understanding from the minister's answer is that there was complacency in collecting those records, and that crept in and caused a failure in that system. So I guess any system is probably vulnerable to the same type of complacency. And obviously having a vaccination registry to back up this system may be helpful, and I think it will actually strengthen the system that was in place and was allowed to become complacent. Complacent, I guess, to the point where in the Anglophone South School District, out of about 24,000 students, I'm just going really rough here, I don't have all the exact numbers, but in that school system there was between 5,000 and 6,000 incomplete vaccination records. So are we any closer? I mean, do we have a better picture? I mean, how many incomplete records are there now in Anglophone South? Do we know that?
Mr. Chair, through you to the member opposite, approximately just over 3,900 still incomplete there. It's one of the ones we're still waiting, one of the two districts we're still waiting for a large number of results to come back from. Again, I will emphasize, because my concern with all this discussion, this has nothing to do with this bill. This bill is about a firewall against a rising tide of anti-science, populist backlash against institutions that have served our country well. I'm very happy to answer questions about the vaccine procedures, but that is not the subject of this bill.
In the minister's mind, it might not have anything to do with this bill, but in my mind, it has a fair amount to do with this bill. So I'm going to continue. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to maybe now switch to the scope of the bill. Can the minister please explain to me what is the scope of this bill? By that I mean, who does it cover and what does it cover?
Mr. Chair, through you to member opposite, the bill covers all students enrolled in New Brunswick's public school system and also licensed daycares, early childhood education centres, also licensed by the province of New Brunswick. I think that was, I believe I covered both parts of your question there. If I didn't, please ask me and I'll happily come back.
Thank you for that. We know there's other people in the school system. We know there's teachers, there's janitors, there's cafeteria workers, we have bus drivers, EAs. There's a number of other people in that school system who may or may not have their vaccinations up to date. Are there plans to broaden the scope, the people scope, so that we encompass everybody that's in the school system?
This bill stands as it is, that if the member opposite was ever interested in discussing additional bills to make sure that New Brunswickers are protected from vaccine-preventable diseases, I'd certainly love to sit down and talk to him about them.
So there are no plans to broaden the people scope of this bill. So we are going to mandate all students be vaccinated, but we're going to exempt all of the other people in the school system. Am I hearing that right?
Yeah, this is, as I said in my opening, that this is a question of restriction of rights, which I take very seriously, because as much as possible, having had the pleasure, but in some cases it wasn't, the opportunity to live in countries that don't have functioning legal systems, health systems, and so on, I'm very wary of government overreach. In this case, making sure that children who are unable to protect themselves are protected from the dangers that come from conspiracies and the dangers that come from folks who, no matter what intentions they may have, are causing decisions to be made that could result in their injury or death. I believe that fundamentally protecting the safety of our children in this province has to be one of the most fundamental responsibilities that we have as legislators, and that's the scope of this piece of legislation.
I find that confusing because there's almost like some kind of contradiction in there where you're saying we want to protect these children, but yet you're allowing quite a number of people within the school system to interact with them who may also put them at risk. So I don't know. I'm having a hard time to digest just that whole contradiction in that answer. So we are going to mandate that students are fully vaccinated, and we're not going to mandate that any of the adults or people coming in and out of the schools are as well vaccinated. And to me, it begs the question, how, yeah, it may protect them from their peers, but when I went to school, I interacted a lot with my teachers, and I can remember my grade 1 teacher, bless her soul, she used to always give me a big hug and a kiss every time I'd walk into the classroom. And so it just kind of, it doesn't really jive with me, so it's confusing to me that the minister is not willing to expand that to other sectors of the school so that he's fully protecting these children.
Again, if that's something he would be interested in talking about, certainly an interesting subject of conversation, but this is a bill specifically talking about the minor children in our school system. And that was the scope of the bill, and this builds on a number of other initiatives that have been used to similar effect and have had success rates in driving up vaccination rates, not just for students, but for adults, not based on pressure through any legal means, but on seeing that their children are getting vaccinated. The vaccination rates have gone up for adults. We're reading a report that came out of France when they had moved in this direction, Italy, and remember one person they interviewed said, look, I actually had no idea these weren't mandatory, which I think gets back to your point earlier around complacency, that people had become complacent about vaccines. Many people today think that they're mandatory. So the process of signaling the societal importance that we place as legislators on vaccines has a public health outcome that's positive. It will have positive effects beyond that. Most countries that have introduced mandatory vaccines for public school children have seen measurable increases in vaccination rates, sometimes 3%, other numbers as well. And happy to provide all of those details for the member opposite and any colleagues if they'd be interested in that as we go through this conversation. So the results and the effects of legislation like this are clear and they are positive. And I don't see it as being a contradiction. The children also go out and interact with other people outside of school. The point is, just as we've gone through these discussions around COVID-19, and now we all know that if you can reduce exposure, it helps. And that's what this is about. So it's a reasonable limitation on a group where we have a specific legislated responsibility to provide protection. And I hope that part of this conversation will lead to increases in vaccinations for adults. And certainly a pharmacist I spoke to talked about how there'd been a Cardy bump in vaccines last year because of the fight that the discussions around this bill had prompted, which for all of its sometimes heat and sometimes nastiness, I think that's at least one positive thing that's come out of this. But at the same time, unfortunately, we're seeing a continued growth of the organized anti-vaccination movement, and that again is the reason why this legislation is before us in the House, not because of anything to do with our school vaccination registration process, the provincial vaccination registry, or any of the others entirely valid points that the honourable member asked, which I continue to be more than happy to respond to as we go through this.
I'm like somewhat confused because, and I know that's easy, member from Sussex, St. Martin's, I know that's easy for me to be confused, but I just find it confusing that we're saying if you're a child and you're not vaccinated, you cannot attend school. If you're an adult and you're not vaccinated, you can attend school. And to me, it just, I don't know, it just doesn't sound like something that is, I guess I could say fair, but it's not affording, I think, exactly the outcome that the minister is looking for in protecting, these children while they're in school. So, I don't know, I guess I don't think I'm going to get the clarification I'm looking for on that specific point. So I'm going to just maybe move on to a few other questions. Well, I got lots of questions actually. On the scope of the bill, who decides what drugs or what vaccines are actually going to be covered by this bill, and what is the mechanism to add vaccines? We know that there's vaccines that are in development on an ongoing basis. So my question, I guess, would be, who controls that, and will this bill be specific to the vaccines that are available today, or will there be a mechanism for vaccines to be added as they are developed, and who or what process will control that, that whole adding or subtracting of vaccines?
Through the chair to the member opposite, it comes from public health regulations, and it's based on the National Advisory Committee on Immunization. So they add and delete and modify the vaccine schedule. So this bill in no way touches the vaccine schedule. This bill is very specifically about removing religious and philosophical exemptions as a reason not to provide the already mandated proof of vaccination to attend New Brunswick public schools or licensed early childhood learning centres.
Yeah, okay, so it's public health who gets their directives from the Centre for Disease Control, Canadian Centre for Disease Control, or would it be from the federal government? Or like the guidelines come to who is the person that sends these things to the Chief Medical Officer of Health so that she can make that decision? Maybe I didn't understand your answer.
You join in that I didn't really understand your question, so maybe see if I can hop up if I've got it wrong. But I mean, there are epidemiologists and virologists and vaccinologists who spend their career working on these things, and they work through that. Excuse me, one sec. I apologize. Through the national center, and that's their job, is to come up with the vaccines that are approved or not approved for not just for bills like this, but for all of us. Excuse me, one second.
Well, I'll ask for a further clarification, because you talk about these professional people. You said vaccinologist or immunologist, and these people, and you said they work at a center. Where is this center, and how is this center funded, and who makes the decisions in that center? Do they all have a meeting and say, we need to mandate this? I'm just trying to figure out how all of this gets onto the vaccine schedule.
Mr. Chair, through you to the member opposite, the details of the organogram around federal public health structures is certainly not in my department's remit. I can certainly get you that information, but what we are talking about here is our nation's scientists, who your party leader has correctly throughout this recent pandemic said we should be listening to and respecting. That's their voice. When they say a vaccine is safe, that's the verdict that they send out, and they include, or if they believe that subsequent studies cause them to revisit their belief in the efficacy of any particular vaccine, or to update the formularies they often do as new vaccines come on the market that are seen as improvements on the old ones. That is the work that they do. Where their office building is located, I can certainly get that for you in one sec, as soon as I can figure out how to get Skype working again.
I don't think that's the question that I asked, that exactly where their office building was located. I was trying to gather exactly what this whole group of professionals you were talking about, what they are. So now, from your answer, I kind of gleaned a few little words here and there that they are a national federal agency of immunologists and vaccinologists and all of that. Am I correct there?
Chair, through you to the member opposite. So the National Committee works out of Health Canada, which is obviously the federal equivalent of our provincial Department of Health, and who take responsibility for issues of public health and include folks in their team, such as Dr. Tam, who's led the public facing response to COVID-19 from the federal level over the last few months. So that's the structure that we're dealing with. Again, I like to remind the honourable member, the subject of this bill is in New Brunswick school children and removing religious and philosophical exemptions, not changing the vaccine formula, not adding to it, not taking away from it. And I would certainly be surprised if there was any sentiment on the opposite side of the House around doing anything that would undermine the credibility of the folks in Ottawa and across the country who work in our public health offices, who've been doing yeoman service the last months, making sure that we get through COVID-19. I'm perhaps missing a point of the member's questions here, but I'm unsure as to the relation of his line of questioning to the bill, because usually the questions I get about whether or not this is the CDC. The CDC is an American organization, not a Canadian one. And I get many emails from people asking me about what the CDC is telling me to do, but I would hope that all the members in this House would know that we are dealing with Canadian institutions, not American ones.
Well, Mr. Chair, I would certainly ask the minister's forgiveness if I'm not as well read as he is on this subject. My questions, Mr. Chair, are just trying to clarify in my own head why it's necessary to do this. So, you know, I understand the minister wants to cut to the chase and he wants this to be over with because he finds it a little uncomfortable sometimes when I'm asking him questions. But I'm trying to justify it in my own mind, Mr. Chair, and so, you know, it is what it is. I'm going to ask the questions that I have because I want answers to those questions, because I don't actually subscribe to all of the same information sources that the minister gleans his information from. I don't have a lot of trustworthy information, but I'm sure that the staff members who are advising the minister are able to get me some reasonable answers, so that maybe some of my concerns around this whole process can be allayed. So I mean, you know, I get it, but you know, the previous answer, I asked for a little explanation on who these vaccinologists were, and I got this 2 or 3 answers, and finally I was able to figure out, okay, they're a branch of Health Canada. So they're a branch of Health Canada is like 6 words, Mr. Chair. So I mean, you know, I need some clarifications, but I'm not totally inept. I do understand some things, and I'm capable of understanding some things, and I don't need, you know, all of this pomp and ceremony around each question that I ask. So I would just appreciate it if I ask a question that I could get a straightforward answer. That's all I'm really looking for, and I find it kind of disturbing, you know, that I have to keep digging and digging just to get a straight answer. So I'm going to continue. So what percentage of school children are there that we actually know they have proof of immunization?
Mr. Chair, through you to the member opposite. First off, I'd like to apologize for any impression that I was being condescending, and some of the long-windedness there was just waiting until I made sure I had the answer as I was getting reconnected on Skype. Not an intention to undermine your part of this important process at all, and I'm glad you got the answer, and even if it took longer than you would have liked. Can I ask you just to be really clear with that question, because there was potentially 2 different questions in yours about how many students have provided proof of vaccination to the system? Is that the question you'd like answered?
Yeah. To date, how many students do we have proof of immunization? 1,000 students, I believe.
Okay. Give me both, please. Mr. Chair, through you to the member opposite. The reason I was asking for clarification on the exact numbers there was that in some cases, the issue that you've been digging into around the way that the vaccine records were kept, that sometimes people provided partial proof and so on. So there were differences between providing information to the department and providing complete information to the department. So we have got some information from over 80,000 kids as of August of 2019. And again, we were supposed to have obviously every year that changes because you get a bunch of kids leave and a bunch of new kids come in for K or whatever year they come in. And so it's in that process of data collection was what was interrupted with COVID in March. So at this point, around 80,000 data sets, but some of them may again be incomplete. And that's the part that we are trying to nail down, which was the thing that was really missing in the records as they've been kept for the previous many years. Hope that answers your question.
Boys, I needed this. Absolutely it is. Well, thank you for that answer. So actually, you know, I did some right to information requests around those numbers, and I'm pretty surprised at the number that you're giving me, because when I looked at what I received from the school districts, my number was like around 17,000. So I'm just wondering if it almost seems like it's gotten a little bit worse. So I'm saying, you know, I'm going to take it at face value. I'm sure that COVID's played a big part in all of this record keeping and all of the difficulty in trying to get things up to date. But it does seem to me that it, according to what I had, but maybe like the information I got might have been incomplete, because you know how information requests work. You don't always get everything that you ask for. But the numbers that I had were actually a little better than the number you gave me. So I think we'll go with my numbers just to try and make your efforts look a little more meaningful. So if a parent believes that his child's been vaccinated, like honestly, you know, like my kids were vaccinated, but if you ask me to produce their records, there's a little card that we all got as parents. No, actually she doesn't, because actually my son actually moved to Seattle and he needed to get his vaccinations looked at, and we couldn't find the record. So yeah, so but I want to know if a parent believes they've been and they can't find the proof, what type of supports does the province have? We have all kinds of new pages today, I mean, and aren't they? They're just great. So if a parent can't find that information, what type of support can the department give them to help them to maybe access, I don't know if there's a database somewhere, there must be some information somewhere. So what type of support's available?
Through Chair to the member opposite, the couple of things they can do, and first to totally sympathize. Again, I remember once having to go, and I had my passport and vaccination records stolen, and had not kept copies, and had to go and have all of my vaccines done again before I could go to a country in sub-Saharan Africa that wanted proof of every single vaccine, and that was an uncomfortable couple of days. And but in our efforts to try and make sure that we're lining up this bill with other parts of government policy, Public Health is rolling out their provincial vaccine registry to save people like you and me and everyone else in the province who loses their little cards, so that in the future that information will be centrally accessible. You'll be able to get it easily no matter where you go, and that's a part of a global movement to try and put a lot of those records online, which obviously I think makes sense. For now, you can get asked through the school, through health, through your doctor, or through public health to get copies of your vaccination records or to get your vaccines boosted or to get caught up. So there's the whole range of government services you go to for any health service you can access to make sure your vaccines are up to date. And the great thing about vaccines is that given that they are essentially entirely safe, is that you can, even if you forget and already had a booster, you can have another one. All it's going to do is make your arm sore for a little bit.
In my case, I'm adverse to pain. I'm not really somebody that likes to have needles poked into me, and I don't like to feel pain. So if I can avoid that sort of stuff, obviously I'll do it at all costs. Gee, I had a question in my... Okay. So back when I went to school, and this is many years ago, and it was vaccination time. Yeah, that's true. So it's been like over that for sure. So I know that like vaccinations were given a lot right into school by the public health nurse. They'd come and they'd line up all the kids, and there'd be the one kicking and screaming in the back because they were afraid to get a needle, but they were given by the public health nurse. What's the percentage today where the vaccinations are actually done in school, or are they mostly done in a doctor's office?
Here, through you to the member opposite. That's an excellent question that actually in all the questions I've been asked about vaccines over the last year and a half, no one has asked me that one. So just 1 second, I'm just going to see if I can get staff direction, and if they can't right now, because again, it's not one I've heard before, we'll get it to you as quickly as possible. Just give me 1 second and get some direction from staff. Chair, through you to the member opposite. So don't have those exact numbers, but and it'd be hard for us to get them because a lot of it gets into health information that I wouldn't be privy to, but certainly if it's something that really interests you, let me know and we'll certainly dig into it. But the public health system interacts with schools right now for the grade 7 and grade 9 boosters, which are still done in the school setting, and the rest again will be done through public health or doctors or whatever other person that a family decided to access. But it's hard for us to get that because of the wonderful silos that divide our lives in this job.
Yeah, the wonderful silos. I guess the reason I'm asking the question, and one of the things that's really, gets me thinking, my head sometimes rambles on and thinks about a whole bunch of different scenarios, and I know that, and we all know, I guess, that there's many people in this province who don't have access to a family physician, and may not be able to access vaccinations unless they're given through a public health nurse in the school setting. They may not be able to access a doctor to receive those vaccinations. Are there any allowances or any thought being given to that fact that we may, just due to a shortage of doctors, there may be some people that, well, you know what, they don't go and get the vaccination just because it's so much of a job to find a physician to do that?
Chair, through to the member opposite. So that absolutely is an issue. I mean, that's one that affects, it affected your party when you were last in government. It's affecting ours now. And the fact that we've got New Brunswickers, despite a decades-long public health care system, the fact that we still don't have easy access to it is a struggle that every government's had to face, and we've got to keep on working to do a better job collectively at that. But when you asked about what efforts are made to sort of mitigate the absence of a family doctor in some cases, and in this case that is literally what public health will do. So public health does immunization clinics, and they're there to help provide vaccines. It's one of the things, it's a service you can access directly from public health, unlike a lot of other jobs in medicine that are reserved to family doctors or other specialists. So that's one of the intentions there, is to make it as easy as possible. So we certainly saw, for example, after the measles outbreak that you mentioned earlier, that a lot of people went to public health clinics, and for a little while they had to say, look, we need to hang on for a bit because we're trying to deal with this actual outbreak. But then afterwards they dealt with a good number of vaccinations, and that's all to their credit, but specifics around the operation of public health and their vaccine clinics and such outside of the school system would be better directed to the Department of Health. Just, I don't want to be at risk of passing on incomplete information to the honourable member.
Well, that kind of, it kind of helps a bit, knowing that there's like public health clinics. Again, it's been a little while since I've had any interactions with immunization, since my children are adults and pretty much responsible for their own healthcare decisions. I'd like to talk a little bit about exceptions. At this point in time, do we know how many on-paper exceptions that are out there?
Number of exemptions, yes. So, Mr. Chair, through you to the member opposite, just get that exact number for you right now, but I can just put the caveat to begin with, given that we don't have data from 2 districts, this number is not complete, but based on the data that we have right now, and give you that number as soon as it either comes into my ear or appears on my phone. Mr. Chair, through you to the member opposite, at this point we have 1,311, which is approximately 1% of that total. Again, important caveat though, that is excluding 2 whole districts who we haven't got their data yet. One district was ready to send it in just before COVID locked things down, so we should get that hopefully as soon as we can get back to a little bit of normal, and the other district a little bit after that.
No, that's fine. I just wanted to get an idea out of, we know that there's a number of incomplete records out there. We know that there's a substantial number of incomplete records, and I just wanted to get a feeling around how many exemptions there were in the number that we actually know, I guess. So it's possible that there would be more requests for exemptions once we get those records in, but it could also be possible that a whole lot more school children are vaccinated than we actually realize, because we don't have all of the data. We don't know whether we're currently at the right level for vaccinations or not. So I guess my question in all of this is, we know that there's 1,300 exemptions right now in a population of roughly 98,000. Like I don't have the exact number, obviously, but we know that, and that's actually, if that's all there is, it's not a bad number. I mean, it's probably about 1.4% of the total school population. Do we have a breakdown of just how many of those are what we would call a medical exemption, how many would be for religious reasons, and how many would be for philosophical reasons?
Mr. Chair, through you to the member opposite, no, and that's one of the reasons why we want to be able to remove non-medical exemptions, so that we can actually make sure, in part, that we're identifying students who have actual medical needs that require them to get the support that they deserve and require, rather than today where many of them are not even registering in school because of concerns over unvaccinated children around them. But that is, we do not track the difference between those three, partly for privacy reasons and other concerns. That answers your question.
Not sure how putting a tick in a box would invade somebody's privacy, basically saying we have, 10% of these are for philosophical reasons, or 5% are for religious reasons. I'm not sure exactly how that would invade anybody's privacy. And I think it's important information so that we can actually ascertain just how much of a problem it is. I'm going to move on to the one exemption that would remain under this bill. Can the minister explain what would constitute a medical exemption?
Chair to the member opposite, and on the broader question around privacy, I have concerns a lot about our privacy regulations in New Brunswick prevent a lot of useful information from being shared within government and with the public, which I hope that we might be able to work on initiatives around that in the future, because while protecting people's privacy, especially in an age when people are routinely giving up a lot of it on cell phones, the impediments to being able to use that to provide better government services has been, I'm sure you've heard from colleagues in government as well, is certainly a difficulty, that we have to protect privacy where it matters, absolutely, and even strengthen it. But in many cases, some of the regulations that prevent different silos in government from intersecting with each other is kind of problematic. But that's a sidebar for another day. On a medical exemption, the purpose of a medical exemption would be a note provided by a licensed medical professional establishing a link between an issue relating to vaccination. That would be the core of it. And I'd be happy to provide some examples from other jurisdictions where those forms have been laid out in greater detail. But that gives you, I would hope, a broad understanding of it. So it would have to be something from a medical professional.
We keep segueing back to the numbers. I think it's really hard, when we're trying to make decisions and we don't even have the information on the amplitude of the problem so that we can, assess whether or not there is a problem. So we've heard, and some of it anecdotal, some of it, true, I guess. There's cases of children having adverse reactions to vaccines, and sometimes serious, and realizing that it's a very small percentage of vaccines given that are actually problematic or actually, experience adverse reactions, especially serious ones. Given that, I get all of that, and I accept that. But in the case of a child having an adverse reaction to, say, one particular vaccine, do we know if that would exempt the child from further vaccination, or would that child just, have to roll the dice and say, well, hopefully the other ones won't, be as problematic?
So you, as a member opposite, that would be a conversation between that family and their medical professional, and I'm not going to be here to provide medical diagnoses about any adverse vaccine reactions and the consequences medically and so on. That would not be at all appropriate. I would go back to the opening of your question there and saying about finding out whether we have a problem. I'm going to re-emphasize this point. This bill is not about New Brunswick's current vaccination rates in public schools. It never has been. I've been clear on that from the very outset. It's interesting to talk about. I think it's an important part of our public health response, but that is not what this bill is about. This bill is about making sure, again, that we have got a firewall of protection around our school children in the face of a growing and dangerous anti-vaccination movement. And saying that, well, today we don't have a problem is the equivalent of saying, well, I think I'm going to pass on fire insurance because my house isn't on fire. That the purpose of this bill is to make sure that, given that the facts are clear around the efficacy and safety of vaccines, given that there is a growing and well-funded and well-organized anti-vaccination movement that we have all experienced in the last year and a bit, that those folks are not going away. They're getting louder and more organized, thanks in part to responses to the pandemic, as I noted in my opening remarks, and a confluence of bad foreign actors coupled with misguided, or even if they are well-intentioned folks who are trying to look for explanations for horrible events in their families' lives, this is going to be a growing problem. And this isn't my subjective opinion, a cursory look at the literature around this subject shows this is a rapidly growing threat. The World Health Organization has identified anti-vaccination movements as one of the single most dangerous global health threats today. So that's why this bill is on the table of this legislature, not because we have got records, incomplete records from Francophone Sud or complete records from Anglophone West. We're here because there's a growing group of people who, while nearly all cases saying that we're not anti-vaxxers, nearly all cases saying, I had my shots, my kids had their shots. We're ex-vaxxers. We're vaccine hesitant. We question vaccines. That's what we hear from folks. But the reality is that this is, again, a well-organized and growing movement of people who pose a threat to your health, to my health, and to the threat of the people around us, especially people who are medically vulnerable. That's why we're here.
Thank you for that. I'd like to move on to, I guess, the question of education. We know that in New Brunswick, a publicly funded education is a right, it's not a privilege. So could the minister please explain or outline what provisions will be afforded to families who choose not to vaccinate their children to meet provincial obligations to provide a publicly funded education to all New Brunswick children?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. To the member opposite. By the way, I apologize for wincing when I stand up and down. I've got a bad back. It is no reflection on my sentiments towards the member opposite or anything he said. It's just hurts a bit. So please apologize. I didn't want to create an impression that I was making sort of faces at you or anything like that. I was suddenly aware I was doing that. So accept the apology in advance if you don't mind. The question of access to education, absolutely. It's a right that the children who we were talking about earlier, who absolutely do exist, they've been interviewed in the paper, and I can happily put some of them in touch with you. They've said they'd like to talk to legislators who are concerned about this bill. So their rights are being violated right now because of our inaction on this. Not that we've had time to yet, but this bill has certainly been in different iterations under discussion for quite a while now. So in New Brunswick, you can easily access, we have very little controls over homeschooling in this province, and so you're free to take your children outside of the public education system. But while yes, access to public education is a right, there are responsibilities that go along with it. For example, we don't allow students into our schools with allergy-causing substances. There are interdictions against bringing peanut butter, fish in some schools, wearing scents. So we have decided that the access to school is contingent upon following along with a number of different social norms that we decide are important. And as much as I remember when I was a kid and those rules were starting to come in about peanut butter, and I like peanut butter, I thought, well, that's kind of unfair, and no one's going to tell me that I can't have a peanut butter sandwich. Yeah, that's one of those things you sort of, when you think about it, well, no, we have a collective responsibility, and I know that both your party and mine have a history rooted in belief in those traditions, different perspectives on them, but that's important. That yes, we have liberty, but one of the uses of liberty is to protect the more vulnerable folks around us and within our communities. And if someone chooses not to vaccinate their children, then they have that choice, absolutely. But they would have to then decide to under this bill, take their children outside of the public education system until hopefully, at some point quickly, they would choose to read the science, protect their children, and protect their community as well. So they would have options, but those options would not be within the public school in the same way that there are many other restrictions on attendance in public schools. You can't bring peanut butter to public schools. You can't bring a gun to a public school. There's a long list of things you can and can't do in a public school that in some cases mirror restrictions in other areas of society, and in some cases are specific to schools because of their specific nature, places where we're preparing the next generation and also young people who need an additional level of protection as they carry on their journey towards being adults.
Okay, so I want to talk a little bit more about those who, I guess, decide that they'll take their child outside of the public school system. As far as I know, in northern New Brunswick, which I guess is where I'm from, in my area of the province, there are no private schools. So, you know, if a group decided that they wanted to open a private school, would the minister help to, in some way, to maybe provide funding or some operational costs to allow this private school to exist?
Mr. Chair, through you to the member opposite, I am somewhat surprised by that question coming from a representative of the Liberal Party. No, we're in the business of public education, not private education. We're not going to use public funds for the private school system under any circumstances for anyone.
I don't think my question had anything to do with what party I'm from. I was just trying to figure out that if somebody has a right to a publicly funded education, then how do we go about assuring that that right is met? That's an obligation of the province to provide a publicly funded education. So my question wasn't around whether it's a party policy. It was my question and mine alone, and it was around how do we go about meeting the obligation to provide a publicly funded education. So that's what I was getting at. So now, as it pertains to homeschooling, in the Anglophone or the Francophone sectors, is there any differences in what is needed? You know, do we inspect the home or the learning environment before we actually allow somebody to homeschool? Is there any special equipment that's needed? Do parents have to have a special room with special desks or anything like that? So, and is that different from the Anglophone and the Francophone sector?
Mr. Chair, through you to the member opposite. So first, again, on the point of an education right, that I cannot imagine that we would ever have a conversation. The only reason for citing your party wasn't a point of criticism, it was a point of praise that the Liberal Party has always stood for strong public education as one of its bedrock principles, and my party as well, and I think that's a good value. It wasn't a criticism at all. Concern was that if we're talking about private schools and believing that somehow the government has some reason to be involved in those because of a bill like this, then okay, if we're going to go that route, then the league of parents who believe that peanut butter is dangerous, we want our private school because we don't want to send our kids, because that's a restriction on rights today. But more seriously, the kids who we're not offering anything to right now, and I often find it very strange that we don't talk about the immunocompromised kids who aren't at school right now, today, haven't been last year, haven't been the year before that, haven't been there the year before that, because of this issue. No one was there standing up and offering them private schools or public schools, which they can't access. And the reason for that is politics. And that's fine. But the voices that we heard outside, those folks are organizing to create the impression that somehow there is a problem here that needs to be fixed on their side, that their rights need somehow to be recognized, as though they are the rights, as they often compare themselves to, an oppressed religious or ethnic minority. That's the issue here. That the whole fact that the discussion is even taking place around the way in which this group operates is testament to the fact that they're successful in their goals, which is to start to present themselves as being a mainstream alternative to accepted science and the reality of the fact that vaccines work. So when it comes to your question specifically around how easy is it to opt out, and the difference is French and English, there are more people on the Anglophone side who request opt-outs for homeschooling and fewer on the Francophone side. So there are some points in common and then there are points of difference. So the points in common are that you have to fill in a form and go through basically not an application process, but just like this is what I'm doing and why, and laying out your plan of study for your child. And on the Anglophone side, there may be, if there are some concerns, be a discussion with the family directly. And on the Francophone side, because of the smaller numbers, they are trying to meet with every single family to work on a plan and make sure there's support there going forward. And that, just to possibly save you a question, that same respect would be offered to any families who, regardless of my feelings around their motives and what they're doing with in terms of vaccines, if they chose not to register their children in school because of this bill being passed, then they would get that same protection and that same conversation and that same ability to be able to make decisions for their children as they see fit.
So I absolutely do get your point about protecting those who are immunocompromised, and that's kind of why earlier in my questioning I was really wondering about the adults in the school system who also interact with these immunocompromised, and so that was where that was coming from, because I mean, if we truly want to protect them from some of this stuff, then we need to I guess make sure that we minimize that risk as much as possible. And in talking to immunocompromised people that I know, and I know a few, I'm not going to pretend that I know thousands of them. I'm not going to, go on this sort of unproven tangent or whatever. I know a few immunocompromised people, and their biggest fear is the common cold and the flu. So, they're not that fearful of some of these other things, I guess, because at this point in time we do enjoy a high vaccination rate. But I want to get back to homeschooling. I want to talk a little bit more about homeschooling, because to me it's kind of intriguing. I've checked a little bit and I've done a little bit of research on it, and there are a few differences. In the Francophone system, they actually inspect the learning environment. In the Anglophone system, that's not necessary. But from what I'm able to find out, and I went to a few sites of home learning organizations, and from what I'm able to see, there's not a whole lot of material available to Francophones in New Brunswick. So I'm just wondering, does the minister see a need to maybe help to source some of that curriculum, and would the minister be providing curriculum to both linguistic communities, but especially the Francophone community, where their search for curriculum is a difficult one at best? I mean, they may have to go to France to find some proper learning materials, which wouldn't even be the same French. So I guess the question is, I'm trying to get to a question here. The question is, will the minister be assuring these parents that they will have access to the homeschooling materials that they need, should they choose to homeschool?
Chair, through you to the member opposite. First, on the preamble to the honourable member's question around the folks he knows, the reason they're probably not afraid is exactly as you said, is because they know everyone's vaccinated. And one of the reasons why youth vaccinations are more important to deal with right now than adult vaccinations, or that nearly every single one of the anti-vaccination activists will all say completely truthfully that they're vaccinated. And why? Because they grew up in a world where getting vaccinated was a totally obvious thing that you would do with your kids. You wouldn't think of not feeding your kids, you wouldn't think of not getting them vaccinated. And that was because we were still within living memory of horrible diseases like polio and like measles, and people knew people who'd been injured or killed because of them. And so we had generations of protection. Talked about, I always find it interesting with the emails that we get from folks talking about how people who want to protect vulnerable children in their communities with vaccines are fascists. And the thing I find ironic with that is that, that all of our forces, when they went ashore in Juno Beach and the other Allied troops, they were all vaccinated because it was just considered to be the thing to do. It's only in recent years that we're again seeing this upsurge of an ideological content to this discussion, because it's silly. We shouldn't need to have this conversation. Vaccines are safe. They've protected more people than nearly any other invention that our species has ever come up with. And the fact that we are in such a privileged position that we would be able to waste time arguing about it, not in this conversation here, but as a society, this would even be something that would come up, is again of the signs of how malign these forces are that try and organize to push back against this incredible gift that we have as a society. So back into your specifics around homeschooling, the French and English curriculums are both fully available online for anyone who wants them anywhere in the world. And which I probably shouldn't say, given that we try and sell them to some places, but anyway, hopefully no one's watching in Morocco. The curriculums, in terms of additional support materials, we don't provide to anyone outside of the public school system, and we never have. There are, as I was actually just referencing, we have one-off exchanges of curriculum materials with some foreign countries to provide their education systems with New Brunswick material, and on the Anglophone side, AEI, which is a for-profit corporation linked in with education, sell our curriculum and associated materials. But as we move forward, and I think one of the things where the Honourable Member and I, we've had discussions around this, I think we're on the same page. We're trying to move towards a more personalized approach to education that's less driven by enormous curriculum documents and more by experiential learning, and the enormous wealth that, we're talking here about some of the downsides that come from the internet. One of the reasons for recent upsurge in anti-vaccination sentiment has been because of the fact everyone was locked down with nothing else to do but surf the internet. But the internet also is this incredibly transformative tool for education, where I was talking to parents who had their kids, because their university classes were over, who were taking online courses from Oxford, from La Sorbonne, and from other universities around the world, digging into things that interested them, talking to leading world experts on those subjects. So there are opportunities for anyone who, within the school system, to start to use those materials, which we're trying to move towards, and why I'm really proud of our government's move to make sure that every single student has access to technology for the first time, something I would guess that the member opposite and his party would be pleased with as well, because it just seems like a common sense, good idea. But in terms of providing additional materials from the government side to the state sector, again, we're not here to subsidize to private schools. There's a national organization based out of Ontario that helps to coordinate homeschooling activities, and they've got lots of material in different languages, and usually that's where folks go to access those materials, but that would again be up to them. And I think if you ever have the chance to sit in my office, you'd agree that managing New Brunswick's public education system is more than enough challenge without trying to take on the private system as well.
It takes me a little while sometimes to absorb everything. Yeah, I can imagine there's challenges there. I'm just trying to basically wrap my head around the whole notion of homeschooling. I'm not really familiar with the whole concept of homeschooling, and who supplies what and what's available where, and you touched on one point that maybe I could elaborate or ask you to elaborate on a little bit. Connectivity is a problem, and I know that the minister has made some steps to help those who have the worst connectivity. But when we get into, let's say if there's, I don't know, a number of people who decide for one reason or another that they're going to homeschool their children all of a sudden, connectivity is usually worse or weakest in rural New Brunswick. And rural New Brunswick happens to be where I'm from and probably where from a lot of my colleagues are from. It's from northern New Brunswick. We're very rural, and there's many areas that do not have the connectivity that we would be deeming adequate to start accessing a lot of this online curriculum, as the minister says, and maybe sourcing out other areas where we could find information to educate our children. So how do we answer that need? And I know that the minister, did, and I commend the minister for, I don't remember, it was like 1,200 iPads and 300 or 400 computers and some mobile, what do you call those, hubs? But if we see a little upsurge in homeschooling, and these people are facing the same issues as children in our regular school system or parents in our regular school system, and we were okay to say, okay, let's dole out these iPads with data plans on them. What will we do for these people homeschooling? Are they pretty much out of luck and on their own because they've opted to homeschool their children?
Mr. Chair, through you to the member opposite, again, I have no authority over the private school sector at all, so it's difficult for me to answer hypothetical questions around it. In terms of internet access, I mean, those are problems that you sort of alluded to, that they affect the public school system as well. And one of the areas where I'm hoping that the all-party COVID committee is going to be able to make some real headway is to try and push the telecoms and the federal government as the federal regulator to say, like, we have got to start looking at access to high-speed internet connections, whether it's through Wi-Fi available signals or through the cellular network. We've got to start looking at that as a necessity in the same way that we view roads, that we view schools and other essential infrastructure. So I'm looking forward to the honourable member's support for those initiatives, but there are certainly no plans in the work for providing provincial government programs for homeschool kids in terms of accessing Wi-Fi or internet connections. That would not be within the law, not within my power to do, even if I wanted to, which I don't.
So actually, there is a plan in place. It's been in place quite some time now on just around rural internet. I think the issue is that it requires investment, and at this point in time, there doesn't seem to be a lot of will to make the investments around supporting rural internet. So with that being said, I understand. So if somebody decides to opt out of the public school system for their whatever reasons, they're basically on their own. And I'm not talking private schools, I'm talking pretty much homeschooling. They're basically on their own, from what I understand. So when we do decide to homeschool, and it's something that I don't think I could do, but when we do, or when somebody does for one reason or another, whether it be related to this bill or whether it just be related to somebody's lack of confidence in the public system, and there are a few people out there who do lack confidence in our public education system, but when they do opt out, how do we know how they're doing? I mean, is there any accountability, or did the parents just say, listen, I taught the curriculum and they passed? Or, I mean, how do we mark them? How do they get the necessary credits that they need?
I mean, in terms of if you would like more details on how homeschooling works, I can put you in touch with some of the families of immunocompromised kids who can't send their kids to school and have to homeschool. Beyond that, again, I'm the Minister of Education for the province of New Brunswick, for the public school system. I don't have any engagement with the homeschooling sector. It's just not part of the job. They're not evaluated by or within the system in any way. It's a choice to remove yourself from the public school system.
Well, you may have answered my second question around that, which would be, if there is actually a diploma at the end. So I would imagine from your answer that there is no diploma at the end. So and no credits given through the New Brunswick education system around the curriculum that they were taught. or any such thing, so they're pretty much out of luck when it comes to trying to achieve bursaries or entrance scholarships or anything like that, because they don't really have that piece of paper that says that they actually graduated from high school. So there must be some challenges there. So, okay. Yeah. I'm going to move on, I think. I've got like hundreds of questions, but if I pass it to you, I lose my spot. So, I'm sorry. I have to ask you another question, but I'm going to try and ask you a short one because I got a preamble here that might take more than that. It's not equal to your opening statement, mind you. I think that one's going to be one for the record books, but it does have a little bit of a preamble. So I'm just going to ask some random questions here that you may be able to. Yeah, you could probably answer it in 3 minutes. If a child's vaccinated in another province or country, is there anything the province can do to assist that child to achieve those vaccination records or to go and get them?
Chair, through you to the member opposite. Yeah, that when any student arrives in New Brunswick, regardless of when or how, they have 120 days right now to get their vaccine information. And it was one of the first areas of real international cooperation, because at the different points when we've forgotten how dangerous communicable diseases are and get back into realizing, good Lord, we need vaccines, that's when we set up these structures. And so you get a yellow fever card that'll look the same here as the yellow fever card that's issued in Angola or Nepal or anywhere else. And there's a level of international cooperation there that's one of the sort of impressive pieces of the world community that doesn't get enough attention. So it works reasonably well, and one of the reasons for moving towards the provincial online vaccine registries, that'll help take that to the next level, because to your point earlier, one of the biggest problems in places where you don't worry about these diseases nearly as much, you end up with people who again, have a bit more complacency about where their vaccine cards are. Most of my friends and people I care about who live in countries that still suffer the ravages of vaccine-preventable diseases because they haven't finished getting everyone vaccinated, a lot of those folks, they know exactly where their vaccine cards are all the time. It's much more part of like carrying your SIN card in your pocket.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. Thank you, member. We'll call the meeting adjourned. We'll be back again tomorrow. See you at 5 o'clock.
Good job, Mr. Chair. You're an awesome chair.
Did you want to stay later?
That's even better, Mr. Chair.